As the world watched the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer in 1981, few paid attention to the bride's maternal grandmother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, standing discreetly with the royal family. Yet she was far more than a guest. As the Queen Mother's most trusted confidant and a formidable courtier in her own right, Lady Fermoy was a key architect of the very fairy tale unfolding before them. This is the story of how a lifelong, unshakable loyalty to the crown would drive her to make a devastating choice, a choice that required the public and brutal betrayal of her own blood, not once but twice. It is the story of the woman who helped create a princess, but in doing so, lost a granddaughter, revealing the ultimately tragic battle between an ironclad duty to an institution and the sacred bonds of family. To understand the formidable, unbending character of Ruth, Lady Fermoy, you must first understand the world that forged her. She was born Ruth Sylvia Gill in 1908 into the upper crust of Scottish society. This was the twilight of the Edwardian era, a world that appeared serene and confident on the surface, but was governed by a complex and unyielding code of conduct, especially for its women. For a young woman of her class and breeding, the path in life was preordained. One was expected to be accomplished, but not truly ambitious, intelligent, but never so much as to challenge a man, graceful, poised, and utterly discreet. A woman's purpose was not to forge her own path, but to secure it through a suitable marriage. Her destiny was to become the mistress of a great house, a supporter of her husband's station, and a bearer of heirs. Above all, her duty was to uphold the values of tradition, social order, and unwavering loyalty to her class and country. But from a young age it was clear that Ruth Gill possessed a gift, a passion that sat uneasily with this decorous blueprint. She was a musician, and not merely in the way that young ladies were taught to play the piano as a charming parlor trick. Ruth was a prodigy. She was a brilliantly talented classical pianist, a musician of genuine, startling ability. Her talent was so exceptional that she was sent to the continent to study at one of the world's most revered musical institutions, the Paris Conservatoire, in the 1920s. Imagine that for a moment. Paris in the Roaring Twenties, a city alive with art, music, and a new modernist spirit. For a young woman from a staid Scottish background, it must have been intoxicating. This was the world of Ravel and Stravinsky, of Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway. At the Conservatoire, Ruth was immersed in a world of rigorous artistic discipline, a world where talent, not title, was the currency that mattered. For a time, a different life must have seemed tantalizingly possible. A life on the concert stage, defined by her own talent, a life of applause, art, and public acclaim. But the pull of tradition, the sheer gravitational force of the world she was born into, proved stronger. In 1931, at the age of 23, Ruth Gill made the choice that would define the rest of her existence. She turned her back on a potential concert career. She chose duty over her art. She married. Her husband was Edmund Maurice Burke Roche, the fourth Baron Fermoy. He was a wealthy Anglo-Irish peer, a landowner, a conservative member of Parliament, and a friend of Winston Churchill. He was also 46 years old, more than 20 years her senior. With that union in a fashionable London church, Ruth Gill, the gifted pianist, ceased to exist. In her place stood the Right Honorable the Lady Fermoy. She had executed her duty perfectly. She had married not just a man, but a title, a fortune, and a position in society. She settled into the life of a baroness, managing their homes in Norfolk and London, supporting her husband's political career, and producing the requisite heirs, a son who would inherit the title, and two daughters, Mary and Frances. It was Frances, the younger daughter, born in 1936, who would one day become the mother of a future Princess of Wales. On the surface, Lady Fermoy's life was a picture of aristocratic success. The passionate artist had been successfully sublimated into the perfect society wife. But the discipline, the control, the emotional reserve required of a concert pianist would remain the hallmarks of her character for the rest of her life. Lady Fermoy's life and her proximity to power took a sudden and dramatic turn in 1955. Her much older husband, Lord Fermoy, died, leaving her a widow at the age of just 47. For many women of her generation, widowhood marked a quiet retreat into a more private, sedate life. But for Ruth, it was the beginning of her true calling. Her impeccable social standing, her unwavering discretion, and her staunchly traditionalist values had not gone unnoticed in the highest circle of them all, the royal court. Lady Fermoy had, through her late husband, cultivated a friendship with Queen Elizabeth, the wife of King George VI. After the king's death in 1952, this woman became the beloved figure known as the Queen Mother. As the new Queen Elizabeth II took the throne, the Queen Mother established her own court, a parallel world of influence and tradition based at her London residence, Clarence House. In 1956, a year after Lord Fermoy's death, Ruth was invited to join this exclusive inner circle. She was appointed an extra woman of the bedchamber to the Queen Mother. In 1960, this was upgraded to the permanent post of woman of the bedchamber. It was, for a woman of her ambitions, the ultimate position. It was more than just a job as a lady-in-waiting. It was a role of immense trust and influence. She became a gatekeeper, an organizer, a traveling companion, and, most importantly, one of the Queen Mother's closest and most trusted friends. For the next 37 years, her life was dedicated, with an almost monastic fervor, to the service of the Queen Mother and the institution of the monarchy. She became the perfect courtier. She was a fortress of discretion, never gossiping, never revealing the secrets she was privy to. She was fiercely, almost fanatically, loyal. She organized the Queen Mother's glittering social life, accompanied her to the races at Ascot, stood beside her at state ceremonies, and acted as a trusted sounding board on all matters, both public and private. The two women were a formidable pair. Both were widows who embodied the keep calm and carry on spirit of their generation. Both were staunch traditionalists who believed in the sanctity and mystique of the monarchy. It was an institution, in their view, that was the very bedrock of British society, something to be protected from the grubby, changing winds of the modern world at all costs. Lady Fermoy had found her purpose. Her world was now the world of Clarence House, a world of protocol, deference, and absolute duty. But just as she reached the pinnacle of royal service, the messy, emotional, and unpredictable reality of her own family life was about to erupt in a scandal that would test her loyalties to their very breaking point. The first part of Lady Fermoy's grand dynastic plan had gone off without a hitch. In 1954, her younger daughter Frances had made a truly spectacular match. She married Edward John Johnny Spencer, Viscount Althorp, the heir to one of Britain's grandest earldoms. The Spencers were not just aristocrats. They were intimately connected to the royal family, serving them for generations. The wedding was the society event of the year, held at Westminster Abbey and attended by Her Majesty the Queen. For Lady Fermoy, it was a triumph. Her daughter was now Viscountess Althorp, future Countess Spencer, and mistress of a great and historic estate. The family's position at the heart of the establishment was secure. Frances and Johnny settled down on the Sandringham estate, neighbors to the royal family, and began producing children. 2 daughters, Sarah and Jane, were followed by the tragic loss of an infant son, and then 2 more children, Diana and the long-awaited male heir, Charles. From her vantage point at Clarence House, Lady Fermoy's world must have seemed perfect. Her own position was unassailable, a trusted friend to the Queen Mother. Her daughter had married brilliantly, uniting 2 powerful families. Her grandchildren were growing up in the very shadow of the royal family. Everything was in its proper place. The values she held so dear, tradition, stability, and duty, seemed to have won the day. But it was all a fragile illusion. Behind the stately facade of the Spencer marriage, a deep and irreparable rift was forming, and when it finally shattered, it would force Lady Fermoy to make the most brutal and consequential decision of her life. The world of perfect duty and serene order that Lady Fermoy had so carefully constructed was an edifice built on the values of the past. But outside the cloistered walls of Clarence House, the world was changing at a dizzying pace. The 1960s ushered in an era of social revolution, a time when the new ideal of personal fulfillment began to challenge the old certainties of aristocratic responsibility. From her privileged position, Lady Fermoy saw her daughter, a future countess, secure in one of the grandest marriages of her generation, as the ultimate reward for a life of duty. However, this dynastic success was built upon a foundation far more fragile than she knew: the happiness of her own child. As these 2 worlds collided, the seemingly perfect Spencer marriage was about to fracture, forcing Lady Fermoy into a brutal public conflict that would pit her loyalty to the establishment against the most fundamental bond of all, that of a mother to her child. The fairy tale marriage of her daughter Frances to Johnny Spencer had curdled into a quiet agony. On the surface, they had everything: a title, 4 healthy children, and homes on the Queen's own estate. But it was an emotional wasteland. Johnny was a kind, decent, but deeply conventional and quiet man, a product of the old school. Frances was spirited, glamorous, and nearly 2 decades his junior. She was suffocating in the staid, predictable rhythms of aristocratic country life. The birth of her son Charles in 1964 had fulfilled her dynastic duty, but it had not filled the emptiness of her heart. In 1966, she fell in love. The man was Peter Shan Kidd, a charming and worldly heir to a wallpaper fortune. He was married, as was she. Their affair was a passionate, desperate bid for happiness, a shocking transgression against the rigid code of their class. For Lady Fermoy, news of her daughter's affair must have been received not as a symptom of a deeply unhappy marriage, but as a catastrophic failure of duty. In her world, one did not abandon one's post. One did not put personal feelings before the stability of the family and the sanctity of a vow, especially one that linked 2 such important families. She would have counseled duty, discretion, and endurance, but her daughter chose love. In 1967, Frances left her husband and her 4 children, hoping to start a new life with the man she loved. What followed was not a quiet, dignified separation. It was a declaration of war. Johnny Spencer, heartbroken and humiliated, sued for divorce on the grounds of adultery, and in a move that was highly unusual for a father at the time, he demanded sole custody of their 4 children. The battle would be fought in the High Court, a public spectacle that threatened to lay bare the private agonies of 2 of Britain's most well-connected families. A custody battle is always a painful affair, a contest of character and fitness. But the Spencer case would feature a moment so cold-blooded, so utterly contrary to the supposed laws of nature, that it has echoed through the decades with a chilling resonance. The key witness, the person whose testimony would prove decisive in determining the fate of the children, was to be the bride's own mother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy. One can only try to imagine the immense pressure she was under. On one side was her daughter Frances, pleading for her support, for a mother's loyalty. On the other was her son-in-law, the future Earl Spencer, and behind him, the entire weight of the establishment she so revered. To side with her daughter would be to condone her actions, to validate her decision to leave a husband and children for another man, an act that was anathema to Lady Fermoy's entire belief system. It would also align her with a public scandal that could tarnish the family's name and perhaps her own cherished position within the royal household. To side with her son-in-law, however, meant committing an act of almost unthinkable maternal betrayal. It meant taking a public stand against her own child, branding her an unfit mother in a court of law, and ensuring her separation from her children. For any parent, it would be an agonizing choice. But for Lady Fermoy, a woman whose entire life had been a series of choices in favor of duty over personal feeling, the path, it seems, was grimly clear. She took the witness stand, and in the cold, formal language of the court, she effectively disowned her daughter. She testified that Johnny Spencer was the more suitable parent. She painted Frances as the transgressive party, the one who had abandoned her sacred responsibilities. Her testimony, coming from the children's own maternal grandmother, was devastating. It was the character assassination that sealed Frances's fate. The judge ruled in favor of Lord Althorp. He was granted sole custody of Sarah, Jane, Diana, and Charles. Frances was cast out, permitted only limited access to the children she had lost. This single act had consequences that were immediate and catastrophic. It created a wound between mother and daughter that would fester for the rest of their lives, a chasm of bitterness and betrayal that could never be bridged. And for the children, it was a source of profound confusion and pain. Their mother had left them, and now their grandmother, a figure who should have offered comfort, had legally sanctioned her departure. The young Diana, a sensitive and intuitive child of 6, was now cast adrift in a lonely sea of adult misery, a misery her own grandmother had helped to codify into law. The act was a perfect, if brutal, expression of Lady Fermoy's creed. The stability of the dynasty and the preservation of the patriarchal line were more important than a daughter's happiness or a mother's bond. In the aftermath of the trial, Lady Fermoy stepped into the void her daughter had left. She saw it as her duty to take a more active role in the lives of her grandchildren, to ensure they were raised with the correct values, the correct understanding of their position in the world. She would spend time with them at Althorp, and they would visit her at her home on the Sandringham estate. But it was a relationship built on a foundation of profound trauma. She sought to instill in them the principles she held dear: discipline, deference, and a deep respect for the monarchy. For the young Diana, a girl who desperately craved affection and emotional warmth, her grandmother's world of formal manners and emotional restraint must have been a confusing and often cold environment. Yet Lady Fermoy saw something in her third granddaughter. Diana was not as rebellious as her older sister Sarah, nor as quiet as Jane. She had a gentle, pleasing nature, an innate shyness that could be mistaken for compliance. She was, in her grandmother's eyes, a girl who could be molded. As Diana grew into a teenager, Lady Fermoy, ever the strategist, began to see her not just as a beloved grandchild, but as a potential asset, a solution to a growing problem that was vexing the highest levels of the royal family, her own sphere of influence. The problem was Prince Charles. By the late 1970s, the heir to the throne was still a bachelor. His love life was a constant source of tabloid speculation, and his long-standing affair with a married woman, Camilla Parker Bowles, was an open secret and a source of deep concern. The Queen and the Queen Mother knew he needed a wife, and soon. The search for a suitable princess was proving difficult. The ideal candidate had to tick a daunting number of boxes. She had to come from a top-tier aristocratic family with demonstrable loyalty to the crown. She had to be a Protestant, and in the unforgiving glare of that era, it was considered essential that she be a virgin, a bride with no romantic past that the press could exploit. The list of young women in Britain who met this extraordinary criteria was vanishingly small. And then there was Diana, quiet, beautiful, impeccably connected, and with a past that was, by all accounts, spotless. From the perspective of Clarence House, where Lady Fermoy and the Queen Mother held court, she must have seemed like a candidate sent from heaven. She was one of them. She was the granddaughter of the Queen Mother's most trusted friend. She understood their world, or so they thought. She was the perfect, unblemished rose, ready to be picked for the royal bouquet. The two formidable matriarchs, the Queen Mother and her loyal lady-in-waiting, are widely credited with being the masterminds behind what happened next. They began to discreetly but purposefully engineer opportunities for the 30-year-old prince to meet the teenage Lady Diana. Invitations were extended to country house weekends at Balmoral and polo matches at Windsor. Diana, who had known the prince peripherally for years, was now pushed into his direct path. The shy, unassuming girl with the sad eyes was presented as the answer to all the nation's prayers. The plan, a masterstroke of dynastic matchmaking, worked with breathtaking speed and efficiency. The world's most eligible bachelor was enchanted by this fresh-faced, seemingly simple English girl. And Diana, a young woman who had craved love and a sense of belonging her entire life, was swept up in a whirlwind of attention from the future king. In February 1981, after a courtship that was shockingly brief, their engagement was announced. For Ruth, Lady Fermoy, the engagement of her granddaughter to the future king was the culmination of a lifetime's ambition, the ultimate vindication of her choices. Having navigated the wreckage of her daughter's scandalous divorce, she now stood as the triumphant architect of the next generation. This royal union was a masterpiece of dynastic engineering, cementing her family's legacy at the very heart of the monarchy and eclipsing past failures with the promise of a future queen. But in her meticulous focus on the needs of the institution, she had overlooked one critical human element, the emotional reality of the shy, wounded young woman at the center of her grand design. In creating the perfect princess for the system, Lady Fermoy had failed to account for the needs of the person, a miscalculation that would cause the celebrated fairy tale to unravel into a tragedy and turn a loyal granddaughter into the ultimate rebel. But even in the run-up to this glorious day, her counsel to her granddaughter was not one of romantic encouragement, but of cold, hard pragmatism. Diana later confided to friends that when she was gripped by profound doubts and considered calling the whole thing off, her grandmother's advice was brutally dismissive. "Darling," Lady Fermoy reportedly told her, "your face is on the tea towels, so it's too late to chicken out now." The anecdote, whether perfectly recalled or not, captures the essence of Lady Fermoy's worldview. This was not about love. It was about duty. It was a contract, a performance for the good of the nation, and Diana's personal feelings were an irrelevant, inconvenient detail. The curtain was up, and the show had to go on. The very qualities that Lady Fermoy and the Queen Mother had likely seen as Diana's greatest assets, her youth, her shyness, her apparent lack of a forceful personality, were masking a deep well of emotional need, forged in the crucible of her parents' bitter divorce. She had entered the marriage desperately seeking love, warmth, and the stable family she never had. Instead, she found herself in a cold, rigid, and emotionally arid institution, married to a man who was still in love with another woman. From her privileged vantage point at Clarence House, Lady Fermoy would have had a front row seat to the rapid disintegration of the marriage she had helped to create, but it is highly unlikely that she viewed her granddaughter's growing unhappiness with sympathy. As Diana began to buckle under the pressure, developing an eating disorder and making desperate cries for help, her grandmother would have seen it not as a legitimate human crisis, but as a shocking failure of character. In Lady Fermoy's world, one did not complain, one did not show weakness, one performed one's duty with a stiff upper lip regardless of the personal cost. She herself had sacrificed a potential career as a concert pianist for duty. She had sacrificed her own daughter for what she saw as the greater good of dynastic stability. Diana's inability to simply get on with it would have been, in her grandmother's eyes, a profound and bewildering disappointment. She had not raised her granddaughter to be this fragile, this emotional, this difficult. The girl she thought she could mold was proving to be made of a very different and far more rebellious material. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, Diana stopped suffering in silence. She began to fight back, and her chosen weapon was the one thing the royal establishment and her grandmother feared most: the truth. She started to use the media subtly at first, then with breathtaking audacity to tell her side of the story. The point of no return came in 1992 with the publication of Andrew Morton's explosive book, Diana, Her True Story. The book laid bare the misery of her marriage, her husband's affair, her eating disorders, and her desperate loneliness within the royal family. While her involvement was officially denied at the time, it was an open secret that the princess herself had been the primary source, smuggling out tape recordings of her innermost thoughts to the author. For Lady Fermoy, this act was not a cry for help. It was an act of high treason. It violated every single principle she held sacred. The first rule of the court was silence. The first duty of a royal was to protect the mystique of the monarchy. To air one's dirty linen in public was the most vulgar and unforgivable of sins. Her granddaughter hadn't just broken the rules. She had taken a sledgehammer to the entire edifice of royal discretion that Lady Fermoy had spent a lifetime fortifying. The schism between grandmother and granddaughter was now complete and irreparable. According to numerous biographers and friends of the princess, Lady Fermoy effectively disowned her. Their telephone calls ceased. The woman who had launched Diana into the royal stratosphere now turned her back on her, appalled and ashamed by the global superstar her granddaughter had become. She could not comprehend Diana's need for public validation, nor could she forgive the damage she believed Diana was inflicting upon the institution she loved more than anything. A close friend of Diana's later perfectly summarized the fundamental, unbridgeable gap between the two women and their worldviews. Lady Fermoy, the friend explained, genuinely believed that Diana must understand that duty and loyalty are paramount, and love and personal happiness must take second place. It was the creed she had lived her entire life by, the justification for every sacrifice she had ever made, including the sacrifice of her own daughter. Diana's entire life had become a global testament to the opposite belief, that human feeling did matter, that emotional honesty was not a weakness, and that love was not a secondary consideration, but the entire point. It was a clash of two worlds, two generations, two philosophies, embodied in the Cold War between a grandmother and the granddaughter she no longer recognized. What is the lasting significance of Ruth, Lady Fermoy? What is her ultimate legacy? She was a woman from another age, a perfect and unflinching product of the Edwardian era whose rigid values survived fossil-like into the modern world. Her life is a powerful, if bleak, cautionary tale about the immense human cost of absolute institutional loyalty. In her unwavering quest to serve the crown, she twice made choices that shattered her own family. First, by taking a stand against her daughter in a courtroom, and second, by turning her back on her granddaughter in the court of public opinion. She was, without doubt, a key player in one of the great royal stories of the 20th century. She was a kingmaker of sorts, the architect who helped place Diana on the path to the throne. But her legacy is a deeply uncomfortable one. The very princess she helped to create, the one she hoped would be a quiet, dutiful addition to the House of Windsor, became the force that would challenge it and change it forever. Diana's entire public life became a rebellion against the cold, emotionally sterile world that her grandmother so staunchly defended. The conflict between them was a microcosm of a much larger battle. The battle between the rigid, silent monarchy of the past and the more human, emotionally accessible monarchy that, thanks to Diana, was struggling to be born. Ruth, Lady Fermoy, died on the 6th of July, 1993 at the age of 84. She remained a woman of the bedchamber to her friend, the Queen Mother, until the very end. True to form, she had performed her duty to the last. Princess Diana, despite their profound estrangement, did attend her grandmother's funeral. One can only imagine the complex and painful emotions she must have felt, sitting in that church, mourning the woman who had been both her sponsor and her tormentor, her gateway to a fairy tale, and the source of so much of her family's pain. One wonders if, in her final quiet moments, Lady Fermoy ever questioned the stark choices she had made. Did she ever regret sacrificing the love of her daughter and the understanding of her granddaughter on the cold altar of duty? We will never know. She remained to the very end, the perfect courtier, taking her secrets and her regrets with her to the grave. Her life is a powerful, poignant reminder that the most rigid principles and the deepest loyalties can sometimes exact a terrible price, and that in the great palaces of history, the most devastating wounds are often inflicted not by enemies, but by family, in the sacred and often unforgiving name of duty.